Thank you so much for joining us tonight at the Nexus at Hayden Memorial Library. This event is occurring live as well as virtually via Zoom webinar. If you have not already done so, please take just a moment to silence your cell phones and other devices. My name's Rebecca Kahn. I'm the manager of the MIT Press Bookstore. And tonight it's my pleasure to introduce Akwasi Owusu-Bempah and Tahira Rehmatullah, authors of Waiting to Inhale, Cannabis Legalization and the Fight for Racial Justice, recently published by the MIT Press. They are in conversation this evening with Nina Harris. A question and answer period will follow this conversation. If you're attending virtually, you may ask questions by typing them into the Q&A box in your Zoom window. A book sale and signing will conclude the event tonight. If you are attending virtually and would like to purchase a book, please contact books@mit.edu. From the start, the war on drugs targeted Black, Brown, and Indigenous Americans already disadvantaged by a system stacked against them. Even now, as white Americans who largely escaped the fire capitalize on the legalization movement and a booming cannabis industry, their less fortunate peers continue to suffer the consequences of the systemic racism in policing and failed drug policy that fueled the original crisis. Waiting to Inhale illuminates the stories of those on the front lines of the war on drugs, the individuals and communities disproportionately harmed, sometimes seemingly beyond repair, the official and social forces ranged against them, and the victims, legal and political activists, and cannabis entrepreneurs who are fighting back. As attitudes toward cannabis are shifting, now is the opportune time to expunge cannabis convictions and make a place in the burgeoning legal cannabis market for Black and other underrepresented groups who have borne the brunt of harsh cannabis laws. Akwasi Owusu-Bempah is a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto, an affiliate scientist at Canada's Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, and the director of research for the Campaign for Cannabis Amnesty. Tahira Rehmatullah is a partner at Highlands Venture Partners, co-founder of Commons, and a member of the board of directors of the Last Prisoner Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to cannabis criminal justice reform. She has held a wide range of positions throughout her career, from brand building to investment management, and is an investor and advisor to numerous cannabis businesses. Nina Harris serves as a manager of adaptable resolution and restorative practices in the Institute Discrimination and Harassment Response Office and the Institute Community and Equity Office, respectively, at MIT. An equity and violence prevention advocate, educator, and restorative justice practitioner with over 20 years of experience, Nina also consults with institutions and organizations across the country to integrate and facilitate restorative systems and practices. Please join me in welcoming Akwasi Owusu-Bempah, Tahira Rehmatullah, and Nina Harris.
Well, I want to start first. Thank you, MIT, and to the folks here at Hayden Libraries for bringing this space together for a really important conversation. I am very excited to be here with both of you. And I think just for a personal note for me, I feel like it's a very full circle moment and think of my own kind of journey and work, and very similar. My background was in sociology and Black studies, and with a focus on criminal justice and the law, and had visions. I know you're, the police background there. And I think for me, looking at, profession in law and criminal justice and the disconnect and the injustice that I saw is really what kind of drove me to restorative justice, is more of a way to enter that. And then for you, Tahira, I think, well, one, you can't do that work without the intersection of drugs, right? So just clearly, full stop, there's no way that conversation happens without examining our drug policies and the implications. And then I think you bring in this lens of beyond that, even more the possibilities, as we see the industry legalized and the opportunities, both for justice, but, the possibility of this plant, which has this compassionate background, as you speak to, really kind of being able to realize its full potential, and not be utilized for harm. So I am very excited to share space with you. I appreciate and thank you for both your work in lifting up this conversation. But maybe wanted to start it with hearing a little bit about how you came to this work and your work. How did cannabis connect for you? And I'm gonna start. Yeah.
Okay, sure, I'll start. Again, thank you for the invitation to be here. Thank you for everyone that's here today, and thank you for saying our names correctly right off the bat. And it's as uncommon as our names are, at least in Western spaces. So it is an absolute pleasure to be here. As you note, I study the criminal justice system. I actually grew up wanting to be a police officer. So I was born in the United Kingdom. Where the cops walk around the streets wearing silly hats, no firearms. I moved to rural Ontario when I was quite young, and my neighbor was a retired police officer, and I idolized this guy. He was cool, beautiful wife, lots of toys, and he'd tell me stories about his time as a cop. And as I say in the book, watched Beverly Hills Cop perhaps too many times, and I just wanted to be a law enforcer. It was kind of a good thing. I think it kept me out of any serious trouble. Say serious, didn't keep me completely out of trouble, but any serious trouble throughout my teenage years. But I went to Carleton University in Ottawa to study criminology. And the first year I took criminology courses, racial profiling broke as a social phenomenon in Canada. And I realized very quickly that, some of what I'd experienced, certainly what my father had experienced, and he was telling me about, and what other friends had experienced in terms of unjust policing, was much more real than I'd appreciated. I thought for a moment I might be able to combat those things within policing, and recognized that I wasn't going to be able to. So I very swiftly switched my focus from wanting to be a police officer to wanting to study and to write policing. And so I held jobs in government, provincial government, ultimately went back and did my PhD and focused largely on policing and other aspects of the justice system. But as you know, you can't study racial injustice in policing or our justice system without looking at drugs. Drugs generally, and cannabis in particular, are one of the key gateways into the criminal justice system for marginalized populations. It's right in the book that cannabis is a gateway drug, not a gateway to harder drug use, but a gateway to the criminal justice system for our most marginalized populations. And so I'd kind of, been studying changes in drug policy for a while. And when I finished my PhD, I actually came down to the States. I spent a couple of years at Indiana University. And while I was there was a young man who I got to know quite well. He was a PhD student, and he'd spent a lot of his teenage years and early 20s in and out of jail for cannabis-related offenses. He's like, look, I know you guys are going to legalize soon in Canada, because it was kind of on the cusp. He's like, you got to look at some of these reparative initiatives that are being implemented in Oakland and other jurisdictions in the United States, and kind of advocate for those to be adopted in Canada. And so that, took me from my kind of broad criminal justice and policing studies to focus specifically not only on the history of racialized drug law enforcement and its impacts, but also how we could implement a measure of reparations in drug laws as cannabis legalization unfolded. And so started advocating and writing academically, and ultimately met Tahira and did so in terms of this book.
So mine is a little bit of a different background. I grew up in small town Ohio. My parents are originally from Pakistan. Grew up in a pretty traditional Muslim household. So thinking about cannabis, or even on the other side of it, thinking about like race relations, like we were the only brown family in a town of white. That's all we knew. For you, kind of, we're always the other, but we didn't look at it because my dad was a local physician. There wasn't. It was small town. It was quaint. Everybody got along, and I think the politics of everything didn't really hit me until I went to college. 9/11 happened, and then I was on the other side of that, both as a Muslim, and my name is very Muslim. So when you start getting profiled at airports, you kind of, that's when it really started clicking for me, how some of this was impacting people, and not just, a minority group that I was in, but a kind of a wider range too. And I had the good fortune of going to Ohio State, which kind of has like everybody from all walks of life. So you see how a lot of people move through the world in very different ways. And I think that was really eye-opening for me. I kind of came from the initial point that I wanted to be a physician, like my father. Realized quickly that after I shadowed a surgery with him, that I was like, I'm probably not cut out for this. But that element of care, I think, was always in what I wanted to do, and I didn't really know how to bring that to life. So I ended up going down a business path, and again, when it came to cannabis or social justice, I saw elements of it because I was working at a hedge fund at the time of the housing crisis in 2007, 2008. I was actually one of those people who spent time in the housing markets, going from like abandoned home to like study the market. And I was kind of the data gatherer for our firm, and they're making trades based on that information. But I was like seeing the devastation that was happening on the ground. And I was like, what have we done? What have we done as a society to make this happen? And for them, it was just, it was economics. And for me, it was like, these are real people whose kids' toys are, thrown across the lawn because they clearly ran out in the middle of the night. So it was just like these kind of building blocks of different experiences where I was like, how do we do something better that's also not necessarily a nonprofit, but something more in the private sector? Had no idea what that was. Went to business school to try to figure out, what you could do with all of these ideas. And then my grandfather in my second year of business school was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. And at the time he was living with my parents in Ohio. And very quickly you'll see somebody when you're in these situations where you're just trying to find solutions, as was the case for my mother. And she kept coming across cannabis in like her late night Google searches in 2013. And one day she texted me and my sister, and all she said was, "Do you know where to get marijuana?" And my sister immediately called me and she was like, "Do you think this is a test?" And I was like, I think we're a little too old for this. It was also, I have an older sister. My mom did not text her. She texted me and my younger sister. So we're like, we clearly know who you think might know something here. And it was interesting. My parents are pretty traditional. Like they believe a lot in homeopathic medicine. So I think there was an openness to plant medicine, but we, child of the 80s, 1980s, like Nancy Reagan, just say no. Like we all kind of lived and breathed that. And then I went down this rabbit hole doing research as well, and was really surprised at what I found. Like I had no idea how the war on drugs came to be. I had no idea about the narratives behind them. And, at that time, it took work to find out that information. Now it's not as much, but it did take work then. So there were like some very nice, like deep holes I would go into. And I was like, how do we not know this? How is this so hidden from textbooks and just general learnings? And so on one side, that was really interesting. And then on the other side, I was like, if there's something that can help my grandfather as he is in his last several months of life, why don't we have that available? There's clearly information. So at that time, I didn't know that there were legal jobs to be had in the cannabis industry. And then it was just kind of right time, right place. I was graduating in 2014. It's right when the cannabis industry, Washington and Colorado were the first 2 states to legalize adult use. So things were starting to happen. And I figured this could be a very short-lived career and I'd have great stories to tell, or this could be the beginning of something that actually combines the things that I figured out throughout life that I cared about and never really knew how to put together, which was like providing care, service to others, but also doing it in a way that, can impact people and economic community building. And I think all of that cannabis has the opportunity to do. We're still figuring out just how to do it.
Yeah, no, thank you. And
Making sure we get content for socials. Always.
No, I thank you both for, again, kind of just setting us what your connection was. And you talked about your experience of just taking that dive and recognizing how much information wasn't available and how that's changed. But I do appreciate the book as, a tool for that, awareness and education. And so before we get a little bit more in some of that content, I just quickly, your individual journeys, but how you came together, and to do this project and what was the catalyst for that. And, just these 2 great pathways connecting to promote this work. So.
The first time we met was at a conference at McGill University I think it was April 2018, and definitely 2018 month is questionable. And it was predominantly people from Canada who are working on more of the research, regulation, policy side. And I was maybe one of 2 or 3 business people who were there. And Akwasi actually spoke the first day. I spoke the second day, and listening to his talk, I thought to myself, oh shit, we're saying the same thing, but it was like, I wasn't expecting that. And so it was, I'd listened to all the other lectures, and And his, I was just really struck by, his lens on kind of this intersection of race, criminal justice, the economy, all the information that he was sharing. So I had to go home that night and rewrite my speech because I was like, it's going to sound like I just ripped off this guy's the day before. And then, yeah, I think we started talking at dinner that night and kind of kept conversations going. There was another conference for the economists that I think was the following year. And it was actually, it's all credit to Akwasi. He had been thinking about writing a book and had initially invited me to write a chapter. Clearly, I hijacked it, and it was just, but it kind of evolved from there, and just like us getting to know each other more, and then also wanting to kind of bring a whole picture and realizing too in our experiences that we live and breathe this. It kind of feels like we know it so well, but so many people don't. And we just really wanted more people to know at a baseline just for awareness, and then to be able to pass the mic so people could tell their stories. So there's like a humanization and a demystification of like, what is all of this? And it kind of went from there.
And I think, we have a lot of the same perceptions about the problems, historical and contemporary, but come at this professionally from very different places. And I think that was, what I saw as the beauty of inviting Tahira initially. It was funny when we first, I remember going to ask her if she wanted to work together, and I felt like I was going to ask someone if they wanted to date. Like, oh, she might say no, but these two different perspectives coming together, right? Like, the business side coming with that angle and that experience, importantly, because she had been and is in the industry. I engage with industry, but I'm an industry outsider. I'm an academic, and I've done the advocacy work, and so it just seemed like so natural a fit together. And I believe that the product demonstrates that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's apt marriage, especially for where the time and place we're at in the work. But, maybe I think now pulling back and speaking a little bit to the history, right, of how we got to this moment. And the book does a good job of just kind of giving that, historical perspective and bringing us into this moment. So maybe, if you want to.
Yeah, let's start, even with the history of our drug laws period, and then cannabis in particular. And so, the book's subtitle is The Fight for Racial Justice. And I think we need to acknowledge that our drug laws have been rooted in racism from their very inception, right? So as a Canadian, I think about the first form of prohibition in Canada was alcohol prohibition, which applied only to our Indigenous populations. And then subsequently, the Opium Act of 1908 was developed specifically to target the Asian population, largely Chinese laborers who'd been imported, recruited, invited to come and help us build the railroad that spans across Canada. And once that railroad was complete, and some of the same history mirrored here in the United States, but once the railroad was complete, those laborers were competition for the white majority. And so there were race riots, and our elected officials were taking trips to the West Coast to see what was happening. And they saw that the Chinese people, as many others were using opium, but the Chinese people were smoking opium and doing so in dens. And the government recognized very quickly that if they criminalized the substance and associated that substance use with a certain population, that they could control that population. And so we saw, in the initial statistics, it was primarily Chinese people who were being criminalized for opium use, even though it was, fairly widespread across the population. But a decade and a half later, we have our first kind of expanded drug law that included marijuana. And we had people like Emily Murphy, who was first female magistrate, often celebrated as a famous Canadian, who was writing, for example, about the dangers that racialized immigrants were posing to white people and the white majority in Canada. And again, one of the big concerns was the drug use that they were bringing with them. And, when you look south of the border, Harry Anslinger, often, pointed to as one of the greatest champions of the drug war, and his drug war musings and writings. He's responsible for, the creation of many, of course, American drug laws, but he was so closely tying the use of drugs to different racialized groups, especially, Mexican immigrants, again, coming up post-revolution. Even the terminology, the word marijuana, right, with its Mexican roots, again, to tie it to the specific population. And so we see time and time again this highly racialized connection between a substance and a specific population and its criminalization. And I'd argue that in many ways it kind of started in Canada, was imported to the United States, and then the U.S. ran with it, took it to the UN, leading to the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, 1961, which really made this an international phenomenon. And as you look across jurisdictions, it is largely people from racial minority groups who end up being overrepresented in drug enforcement action and ultimately in incarceration. And again, because cannabis amongst currently illegal substances is the most popularly used illegal substance. It is the one that the most people end up getting caught up in the criminal justice system for. And then, and I hope we will, I don't want to go on at length now, but talk about some of the effects of that criminalization.
Well, that was kind of going to be my.
Exactly. I don't want to scoop your question. So I'll pause.
No, I appreciate you, I think, making that connection. And I think that was exactly where I wanted to go, right? Like, how do you see the implications of that history still playing out today, in the racial nature of?
Yeah, so I'll start this off and you can hop in if you want to. So I think one of the things we need to recognize is when you look at the drug use surveys, whether they're governmental or done by academics, we see relatively consistent levels of drug use for many substances across racial groups. There are certain substances, powder cocaine, for example, sometimes some forms of psychedelics, that white people are actually overrepresented amongst users. But when you look at those that are targeted for enforcement action, it is, in this country, primarily Black and Hispanic populations who are overrepresented in those statistics. So there is, again, no doubt that the drug war is heavily racialized. An individual who comes into contact with the police and the justice system for something as minor as a simple cannabis possession offense has their lives derailed in so many ways. And we tell numerous stories in the book of what's happened to people. But if you think, they have a harder time completing their education. They have a harder time engaging in the employment sector, getting jobs because of criminal record checks. They have a harder time securing stable housing, inability in many jurisdictions to volunteer, to travel, all of the very things that you think about, many of us would think about as part of our daily lives and our ability to navigate a society. So even a simple cannabis possession conviction, let alone a trafficking conviction, many people enter the drug trade due to lack of opportunities or a lack of, desirable opportunities out of need. But even that simple possession can completely upend an individual's life. But it's not just that individual that's harmed. And when we talk about scale, we're talking hundreds of thousands of these convictions a year in the United States, right? These are not small numbers. But it doesn't just affect those individuals, it affects their families, of course, as well, right? These people, mothers, fathers, brothers, or sisters, but contributors to a family. And so this disadvantages families, but it also disadvantages communities as well, too. The old adage, when you're going to get a job, is not what you know, it's who you know. Well, if you live in a marginalized neighborhood that is over-policed, there's a high likelihood that there also a higher proportion of people who are criminalized. And so your social network becomes one in which criminalization is present. And importantly, other forms of social capital are actually reduced in part because of criminalization and drug law enforcement. And so, there's the impact on the individual and their ability to finish school and get jobs and get housing, what it does to their families, increasing levels of poverty, dependence on, things like social assistance, but also at the kind of neighborhood and the community level. And you can see very clearly when you look at the arrest and incarceration statistics that they are heavily concentrated, right? Like you can start to get these down to the block level and see where there are neighborhoods and areas that are just disproportionately impacted. And again, these tend to be our Black and our brown neighborhoods. And so we talk about this resource transfer. The money spent on policing, on courts and corrections, like $70,000 to see a felony cannabis conviction through the system. That's a huge amount of money, right? So policing agencies, courts and correctional institutions get this money that's not being spent on schools, on hospitals, on job skills and training centers, all of the types of things that you need to have vibrant neighborhoods. And that doesn't even, start to get to the private involvement in this. The police officers are supplied by private industry. They've made billions of dollars waging this war on drugs, right? The same goes for correctional institutions. There are, of course, private prisons, but, prisons need soap, they need bedding, they need food, and private industry benefits from this. So we've had a resource transfer out of these over-criminalized, marginalized communities to, politicians and justice agencies who've waged this war on drugs and the private industries that have supported them.
Thank you for laying out, again, those kind of the law enforcement kind of implications, but I'm curious to hear from you how that shows up in inequities in the industry.
Yeah, I mean, it's across the boards. I think I often give this example that several years ago, I was moving, my financial accounts from one institution to another, and I ended up getting blacklisted from a major financial institution where I was like, wait, what? Because I work in cannabis. And, I'm educated. I had money to my name to put into a bank account. I'd been with large, organizations that were reputable. And I'm literally like the terminology blacklisted was used against me. Like I can never be at this financial institution again. And I mean, if that's happening to someone like me, then imagine what happens to people who have, misdemeanors, felonies, like they don't have access to the resources. And for someone like me who, look, I can call a couple of people and find out ways to, move through systems. But what about somebody who's trying to get their record expunged? How do you go about doing that? I wouldn't know how to do that today, but I would have 3 people that I could call who could probably direct me in that, on the right path. And so when you think about just like the services, the opportunities, it's one thing when you're also sitting in prison, but then once you get out, there are no services to help you. There's nothing beyond that. The recidivism rate in the US is exceptionally high compared to the rest of the world. We all often look at Norway as like what their prison system is like versus the US because they have one of the best ones. They have a 20% recidivism rate after 2 years, and that drops to less in a 5-year window. And so because what they're doing is they're training people, they're giving them like livable environments. They're not torturing them while they're in there. And, they're trying to provide for them so they can be actually rehabilitated when they come out versus needing to go back into that cycle of poverty and crime again. And, as Akwasi was mentioning, like there's so many things that you don't have access to. One of the big things is that you can't vote if you're a felon. So what is your contribution? What is your feeling for the country that you're living in, for the community that you're living in, for the contribution that you're able to make, or the contribution that's kind of being made back to you as a citizen, as now somebody who's trying to pay your taxes? There are all these strikes that are against you. And what we talk about is like one of the major things that needs to happen is expungement of records or clearing of records as an automatic element as legalization is happening. And what so many people are surprised by is the fact that that's not happening. That's not an automatic thing that happens anywhere. Some places have started, there has been like Code for America has done a lot of great work in the Bay Area and trying to create programs that in more of a fell swoop can allow for records to be expunged. But another issue that really happens and that makes this complicated is that, as Akwasi said, cannabis is a gateway drug or gateway into the criminal justice system. What so many people who are serving time, it started as a cannabis conviction, but then was layered on, like they found a gun in their home. So they layer that on, and then they layer on other elements. And there's so many states that still have a 3 strikes rule. So we know people who are serving life sentences for selling the equivalent of $20 of cannabis in a state where it's now legal. And to our best estimates is that there's still about 40,000 people sitting in jail for cannabis possession crimes that are now legal. And most of that is at the state level. So some people, might remember that in October, President Biden pardoned people for cannabis possession at the federal level, but that was about 6,500 people, which isn't zero, but it's also not 40,000 because most of those charges are actually at the state level. So it's on the states to work through that, and so all of these different layers, you take it from healthcare to education to just rights, are vastly different for those who have been in prison, who are now out of prison, for their families. It's an ongoing cycle.
Yeah, no, words. No, I appreciate that. I think one of the things you brought up that I would love to go into a little bit more is the implications and the difference between state and federal policies and initiatives and some of how that plays out. And so just, curious maybe to hear a little.
In terms of the criminalization, or when we look to legalization?
On both, right?
Yeah.
I think those, and I think that's part of
I
it,
think
right?
that's really,
Different.
so where we've obviously seen the most movement in terms of dealing with the past and looking forward and advancing some of the reparative measures that we advocate for in the book has really been done, of course, at the state level. So cannabis remains federally illegal. It's a Schedule I drug there with heroin, meaning that it's deemed to have high potential for addictiveness and a low therapeutic value, essentially, little in terms of medicinal purposes. You can become habituated to cannabis, but people do not become addicted to cannabis in the way that they do perhaps to alcohol, which is legal, of course. On the therapeutic or the medicinal value, again, the research has somewhat been stymied by its illegal status, but the research is pretty robust that it has a number of uses in a medicinal context. So it remains federally illegal. You know, the Obama administration had indicated that it was going to leave it up to states to kind of do as they wished, and they weren't going to be too heavy-handed. Trump didn't feel the same way. Biden's largely kind of gone back to that. But again, there has been no significant movement with respect to legalization or even decriminalization. At the state level, of course, this is where things differ. So there are states that are holding on to prohibition, and there are states that have moved to legalize. You can look at those like Colorado, Washington, for example, that were moving fairly early, and then newer states that have come online. The older states initially didn't address the harms of prohibition. So now in some jurisdictions, decriminalization and legalization has come about even at the state level out of a recognition of the harms of prohibition, and especially the racialized harms. And there have been efforts to deal with those harms in the models of legalization. And we lay out in the book, and there are largely three ways which we see this can happen. Tahira has mentioned already the clearing of criminal records, and doing so in a manner that leaves the onus on the state to clear those records, rather than doing as we did in Canada, leaving people initially to jump through like a multi-stage, I think it's a 10-stage process if you were a veteran, that still cost money, even though it was supposed to be free, and it was largely ineffective. Jurisdictions taking that on themselves to clear the records. Second part is inclusion in the legal industry, so providing space, and especially space at the top for people who have been either directly or indirectly harmed by the war on drugs. And the third being a reinvestment of a portion of the tax revenue back into those communities that were most harmed to help build kind of healthier and revitalize communities. And we'll get into, I think, a little more depth as to what exactly those look like. But the newer states to come online, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, have done a much better job, you know, Massachusetts, where we are at the moment, in trying to engender some of this change. It's interesting to see, and we note in the book, this is, you know, it's kind of a bipartisan issue. There are, you know, kind of states that are heavily Republican that are seeing legalization a means of generating revenue at the state level. There are others that are doing so out of, you know, kind of a higher principle, so to speak. But at the state level, there is still huge variation. I certainly believe, and I think you do as well, that in order to kind of move forward in the way that we need to see change at the federal level, which, you know, continues to elude us.
I want to come back more to the federal as we
Mhm.
think maybe moving forward in actions or efforts. But who's doing it well? Or what are some things that we can point to in terms of state policies,
Yeah,
initiatives?
Why don't I start with what looks like it's working well on paper, and you can go to the practice,
Yeah.
because there are two very different things,
Yeah.
I think, you know.
Yes.
Like I was very excited by Illinois, by New Jersey and New York in terms of what they were proposing with respect to the clearing of records, you know, so using, for example, the Clear My Record tool developed by Code for America to identify and clear the records of people who'd been convicted of offenses that were no longer illegal, or downgrade those along with the change in law. Similarly, with respect to proposals to include folks in the illicit industry, so dedicated licensing schemes and priority access. Actually, initially, you know, like in New York, just only having equity applicants being able to engage in certain parts of industry. And then with the reinvestment piece as well, right? Illinois, for example, their R3 program, initially, as it was established, looked really good in terms of providing funds for organizations and groups who could apply to a granting program for funds to advance public health, reintegration, and address, again, kind of the harms of prohibition. And I know we have folks that are engaged in this work in the state here. And so I hope we'll get into some of the specifics with respect to our question and answer period. But of course, things have looked very different as they've rolled out in practice for a number of different reasons.
Yeah, so in New York in particular, where I am, you know, a reason why New York, the policy kept failing, or the law didn't get passed, was because people were very focused on the social equity side, which was a good signal that it was so important. And it's actually a massive reason why the Safe Banking Act like kind of keeps falling by the wayside at the federal level, is because there's like the banking side of it, but then there's also this the you know, expungement of records and things, and people feel like those need to be split apart. I think the Democrats are more leaning on like, let's put this all in here. Republicans are more like, let's parse this out. And you know, obviously we'd love to do everything in one fell swoop, but it's challenging with the different initiatives. So New York had, I think, really good ideas. And it's interesting too, that when we wrote the book, New York had just legalized, but had not rolled out anything. And we've joked that like the extension of that would be like chapter 10, which would be like, all right, what's actually happening in New York? It's taken, you know, it almost feels like, I think about 2 years at this point to get that first dispensary license. What New York did is to give priority to people who have been impacted by the war on drugs, have criminal records related to certain cannabis crimes, obviously not trafficking, but at the more of the possession level. And right now, as it sits today, there are 9 dispensaries in the entire state of New York that are open. And what has happened in that kind of 2-year period is that the illegal market has run rampant, because even though New York has had cannabis decriminalization since the 70s, it's not like you can publicly smoke it. It was constantly used as a tool to go into, you know, housing projects, different minority groups, and the Bronx has one of the highest arrest rates for cannabis possession. And so they rolled that back. They made it much more stringent, where, you know, it's now down to a fine, and you can possess up to a pretty healthy amount of cannabis. But what's happened is that now everybody just sells it freely everywhere, and it's kind of done the opposite of what we were hoping. And then the challenge becomes, if you start enforcing it, then you're actually just enforcing it on those same populations that we had hoped to not, you know, keep getting caught up in this. So, you know, I live close to NYU. You go to Washington Square Park, and they're just tables set up everywhere next to people selling cannabis. And you're like, what has happened here? You know, it's so different than I think what everybody was expecting to happen. So it's been this double-edged sword situation. And beyond that, there are, what we hear is about 1,400 illegal dispensaries that have opened because of this lack of enforcement. And we only have 9 legal dispensaries, and people don't know the difference. You know, the packaging looks the same. The illicit market has evolved so dramatically. Like, it's not people making brownies and like putting them in a Ziploc bag anymore. There's like professional packaging. So your average customer doesn't actually know what's what. And so that's actually a really unique thing that's happened in New York, where it's like, you know, we thought they were taking great steps, but there are all these different layers that you have to think about, you know, when you put something in place, and the timing is critical. So because it took so long, it gave opportunities for people to operate in this gray area. The other side of it that was a really good idea and concept that just hasn't played out is that there was a dedicated fund that was supposed to be a $200 million fund, where the state would fund 50 million of it. And then the person who was appointed to lead the fund would help raise another 150 million. And that would all go to supporting these different groups of entrepreneurs at the different levels, because it's one thing to move people who have been impacted by the war on drugs to the front of the line and get a license. But then how do they run a business? Who's helping them? Where's the money coming from? You know, if they're not as well resourced as people who can get investments, it's not like you can get bank loans right now because of the federal illegality. So all those nuances, you know, legal support, accounting, finance, all that kind of stuff. So the fund was supposed to be there for that. To date, the money hasn't been raised. People are already moving to open dispensaries, but there are a lot of people who've been waiting for so long, who've put the capital that they had in, but they still can't get their doors open. And now they're fighting with the illegal market to, you know, for customers to walk in the door. So all good on paper, seemed like it would be a great idea, but it's also about just the actual execution of it. So what we say, you know, is like, we want people to keep trying. There's still a lot of room here. The challenge becomes you have to iterate faster and faster. You have to make changes quickly. And as we all know, legislation moves very slowly. And so it could be a while before the stuff is changed. You know, New York State's talking about how do we enforce properly the illegal locations. There's no good answer right now. And so there's so many places or people who are saying now that they feel like New York is uninvestable from an investor's lens, because they're like, if we're fighting with the illegal market, this is going to be a couple of years before this becomes a market where you can actually earn actual revenue. So I still believe that New York of all places will become one of the biggest markets, but what that timeline looks like is not, to me, not like 2 years, maybe 5 to 10, because there's so much now that has been created in this short time of 2-3 years of policy. And then this is just one example. Illinois also did great work up front on social equity. It turned into all these lawsuits that are still getting resolved now. We've seen lawsuits in New York because then other groups are coming in and saying, well, this isn't fair. These people have been moved to the front of the line, but we've already been operating under the medical environment. And I guess I'm someone who sits in the middle and saying that there are operators who've been there for a long time, who have been kind of biding their time and waiting, and they're paying their dues. And some of these policies actually just put them out of business because they're just spending more and more money to try to keep their doors open. So it's not a great answer on like, okay, what's the best model? But what we say over and over again is that the social equity piece has to be in the DNA of whatever policy is created, because trying to insert it later just never works. So even if it's not working or if it's not the ideal model, it's more important to us to have it at the beginning so we have something to work with and see what does and doesn't work than to not have it at all.
And that's certainly something we learned from the Canadian example. So, in Canada, there was myself and others who were advocating for, these very measures, expungement, inclusion, and reinvestment in our model of legalization. Our government was moving very quickly to legalize, has done a good job of kind of suppressing race-based criminal justice data for decades now. So the statistics that we needed to demonstrate why they were necessary weren't as abundant as they could have been otherwise. And so our model of legalization was largely devoid, was completely devoid of any social equity provisions. On the day of legalization, the government announced that it would implement this kind of quasi record suspension system, but inclusion and reinvestment were just absolutely nowhere to be seen. And so we've now got a 3-year review of the Cannabis Act underway. And, the government, on announcing the review of the act, indicated that it believed that inclusion was a key thing that it needed to do in the industry, but we've now got a completely established cannabis industry. We've got like a extremely saturated cannabis industry, right? So the opportunity, at least initial opportunity, to make money, and people made billions of dollars, individuals made hundreds of millions of dollars when they got the first licenses. We don't have any caps on licenses. That is largely gone. And so now I was doing some work to inform the review, and as we were developing our proposals as to what revisions to the Cannabis Act could look like, we were hesitant actually to propose dedicated avenues of entry, licensing schemes or priority, because we actually worried that we were setting people at this point up to fail. It was like, actually, how do we work to diversify existing industry? We still propose those with the caveat, but it was like, what can we do to diversify the existing industry, and to do so, again, at the upper echelons, the C-suites, the directorships, where people have, the greatest financial stake and the greatest levels of power within the industry, as well as kind of propose these reparative measures. But once the train's left the station, it's very hard to get it back.
Thank you. And again, laying out kind of the history and the implications, and certainly I think the lessons learned that are guiding you moving forward. But I think one of the things that I love about the book is that you humanize this narrative, right? I think the statistics are there, right, when you want to look at them and understand them, but you think you do a beautiful job to raise the stories and the voices that really illustrate what that experience is. And so for you, whether it's for folks who've experienced the injustice and been collateral damage in this war, or some of the possibilities, right? And you have this wonderful chapter about, leaders and folks who have been able to, move efforts forward. What are some of the stories that, really stand out for you, or voices or experience that were important for you to tell in this book?
Yeah, there are a number that stick out for me. I think about like people like Michael Thompson, for example, who now has the Michael Thompson Clemency Project. He ended up being criminalized. His sentence was 42 to 60 years for trafficking a relatively small quantity of cannabis because he had previous felonies, and his cannabis related offense was charged to a firearms offense because he had firearms at his house. And then he spent decades in behind bars for what was at the time a relatively minor offense, and was seeing all of this legalization movement, and importantly, again, people making lots of money. Those are heartbreaking. Jesse Horton's another name that comes up. It's another individual who'd had some previous negative experiences, didn't have quite the same background perhaps as Michael Thompson, but really struggled to get into the industry. And then Once In has done a good job about not only, talking about those struggles, but trying to, build inclusion. One of the ones that I quite like as well, and he's one of the people who endorsed the book, Al Harrington, right? NBA star who has his Viola brands, but I think he and others, I like their stories, again, not because it's one of these come from, as a casualty of the war on drugs and been able to not only escape that, but to benefit, but is doing, great work in terms of promoting the need for inclusivity. And there are him and others who are really helping to bring people in and to provide the funding for people to do so.
And someone like Al also talks about, he was an NBA star. Because he is a Black man, he stayed away from it. He knew that it was something that would just put his life at risk. And, as an athlete as well, he just always stayed away from it. And it was actually, so Viola is named for his grandmother, who suffered from glaucoma. And at one point he got some for her and she tried it and she was able to see better, like within hours. And it was such a impactful moment for him because he was really not interested in cannabis, recreationally, just it was around him all the time. But seeing that, and that's the humanization element of it, right? It's like the care element. When you see something have an impact on someone that you love who has been suffering, it changes your whole perspective on like what you're willing to look at. And all of a sudden it's like, this isn't a terrible drug. This is a plant that actually helps someone who'd been suffering for a long time. And one thing that we really love about Al is that he said he wants to produce Black millionaires. He wants this to become an opportunity for generational wealth for the people who've been fighting for it forever, for decades. And, when earlier you brought up, like, what are some of the ways that people are impacted? A lot of people who've been in the legacy industry, as we call it, don't have a place in the current industry because they don't have the money, or there's some, Oregon, when the state first legalized, the state didn't allow people who had any type of record to participate in the industry. And so those things have changed over time, but those are the types of things that really hinder the diversity, the growth, and really the experience of the people who've participated before to come in.
And I think that's what the stories allow us to do. Again, I look at statistics all the time, and you recognize that there are people behind them, but the emotion just comes through when you're reading people's stories and the hurt and harm that cannabis prohibition has caused these individuals and their families. People talking about being separated from their children, but also the hope as well, right? When you see folks like Wanda James, who's an individual who I think actually first Black woman to get licenses at all kind of like 3 levels, kind of cultivate, like, right through the chain. Like it brings great hope, and it goes from that kind of sadness to the happiness when you read these stories, and that's part of why we told them throughout the book.
Yeah. And I just deeply appreciate that, because again, in those statistics, that's, maybe that one person, but the community, the dozens, and the ripple of that harm, and how that's not captured just by looking at the statistics and really understanding these really human experiences and how they ripple out. I know we're going to go to Q&A soon, but maybe closing the last question. And you kind of mentioned chapter 10. And so what is the next chapter? Continuing the story from here, the work that needs to be done, where the two of you are looking and hoping to see.
Well, I think, Tahira's point about this being a very nascent industry and still seeing a lot of challenges with respect to the advancement of the reparative measures is one that, could perhaps have been expected, but we expect to see positive change on this front. So continuing to track that, I think for both of us, we see cannabis as a gateway in another way. Cannabis legalization in this sense is a gateway to broader drug regulatory change. And so we're already seeing this now. The FDA has indicated that it expects MDMA to be approved for therapeutic uses within the next, I said couple of years, but again, in Canada and other jurisdictions, now Australia, we are seeing access to psychedelics for different mental health illnesses. Hearing chatter out of Colombia, the desire to legalize cocaine. So a lot of my attention is going to looking at the lessons learned from cannabis legalization and thinking about how those can be applied to drug law reform in a broader sense. Psychedelics, we will see, I have no doubt, in the near future. And I think we will start to expand to other substances. And again, you can even look around this country. We have jurisdictions that have decriminalized, kind of all drugs. And I truly believe before the end of my academic career that we will have a completely different approach to the regulation and distribution of what are now, often called drugs, but currently illegal intoxicants. And I believe that we'll have broad drug legalization and you'll be able to get these substances through different channels. And I want to ensure, again, the people who've been harmed by the broader drug war are thought about both in terms of the science and the medicine, right? Because they're currently being excluded oftentimes from the psychedelic studies. The science, just as science generally tends to exclude marginalized and often racialized populations. We see that being mirrored. And I did a back of the envelope calculation of kind of racial representation amongst the C-suites and directors of the largest listed psychedelics companies. And just like cannabis, people that look like us were largely underrepresented.
Yeah, and I think just the extension of that is how are these social equity programs advancing, changing, keeping up with what we're learning real time, and then beyond that, just the research around even just cannabis. I mean, there's actually a lot more historically on psychedelics that has been kind of buried and now is having a resurgence, but the legalization efforts then finally allow for more actual studies around cannabis and longer term impacts. We don't have that information. Nobody's had the opportunity to do those. And a lot of that is in process. So I'd love to just have those checkpoints and going back to just the getting people out of prison, seeing how those policy changes, there's a lot of work. We can flash these numbers. They don't matter until we need to move them. So what are the efforts going behind that? There are organizations that are doing the work. We all know it takes time, but we have to keep pushing that to make sure that it moves, because we can't be having the same conversation in 5 years and in 10 years. And my fear often is that we might still be dealing with those same stats. So how do we push that forward? And I think that's an area that we're both very interested on, just being able to navigate that and bring that awareness so more people are engaged.
Yeah, that's what I'm hearing. There's plenty of work to be done, plenty to go around, and plenty and disciplines, I think, which is again another appreciation of two of you coming together, understanding the multiple intersections of industry and politics and education and community that need to really converge for this to transform. So I don't know if we have Q&A time. So we do have a mic runner.
Hi, thank you guys so much for this talk. I really appreciate it. My name is Ben Lewis. I'm a master's student in the Technology and Public Policy program here. I'm also a researcher in the policing vertical of the Initiative on Combating Systemic Racism. So this is right up my alley. So
just some things.
And I need to recruit you to UT for your PhD.
Okay, so my first question, so you guys talked about the unlicensed market in New York City, or in New York in general.
Yeah, but mostly New York City.
New York City. Okay, yeah. So I guess my question is one, is that really totally bad? And then two, is the goal is to get these people who are selling marijuana unlicensed to get the licenses? And what are the efforts towards getting them there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the first one, I think people will debate it different ways. My lens is that the more you can have in the licensed market, the safer the products are, right? There are so many things. We all hear about fentanyl and all these different things. Regulation, to me, legalizing the industry is about safety, full stop. I get that there's the profit element, there are all those pieces, but safety is number one. And all of these things, the reason why these substances have become unsafe is because they've been pushed underground. A couple of years ago, you might remember that there was Vapegate, because cannabis was legalized, but there were all these unlicensed produced vapes that had an ingredient in them that were making people very ill, and there were some deaths associated. None of those were legal products. None of those were going through the supply chain. Just like we want our food to be tested better, just like we want our medications to be, just like you expect your alcohol to not be bathtub gin, right? That's why I think it is very important to be in the regulated market, because then there are checks and balances. There's third-party testing requirements. We should know what is in the food that we eat, the medications that we take, and the flower that we smoke, right? that's why I think that's important. On the other side, it's a really good question about the unlicensed. So the hope is to get those people into the legal market. And that's why New York in particular has had it so those people who have been impacted by the war on drugs are kind of front of the line. The challenge becomes the time that it takes to get it, the resources that it takes to get into that licensing. And if you have a limited license, which is debatable, is it good to have unlimited? Is it good to have limited licenses? Then where do all the other people operate? Because it's couldn't be 100% participation. There will always be people who do not participate in the legal market for a range of reasons. You know, you can make more money, you know, being outside of the tax environment, there are people who are more used to producing in a certain way than having to go through this like new supply chain. But the hope is to move it all over. And again, it's for the safety ultimately of the industry and the consumer that it benefits everybody. We know that there's plenty of product out there. People have been consuming for a long time. There are safe, illegal producers. You just can't guarantee that you can't hold anybody accountable. And that's ultimately what it comes down to.
Yeah, and I'll just add, like, I think the inclusion in the legal and regulated industry is good again, because that's the kind of thing you can put on your resume too, right? So as you said, there are people that are always going to operate outside of legal and regulatory frameworks. We even see that with tobacco, right? But, you know, when we think about, again, trying to repair some of the harms and trying to get people to places where they can not contribute, but operate in another way in society, you can't put, I slang dope for 5 years on your CV in the way that you could. I operated even if it were a small business, right? And so, but they're challenging, you know, one of the things I see as a challenge is people not wanting to get into what they see as corporate and government weed. And so, you know, a lot of the people that I talk to and I work with who've had conflict with the criminal justice system see our society in a quite negative way. And they see, you know, working within government structures in a negative way. And that's, I think, as well as the other obstacles, the resources and the other things, that's also going to be a challenge in transitioning people over, even if there is kind of incentive and ability to do so.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. My name is Abdullahi. I am a graduate student in the science writing program here at MIT. My first question for the both of you, you both have like very interesting backgrounds, and you know, looking at how you first got interested in this topic and research. But I was wondering, you know, in writing this book, were there any ideas that you had like different perspectives, and you know, how did you resolve? How did you come to a common ground on those ideas? And Tahira, my second question to you is, you know, I'm from a Muslim background as well, but you know, it seems to me like there's some kind of conflict, you know, coming from such background. How does that make you feel, and how do you resolve that?
So we can, thank you for those questions. I think that there was a lot of, you know, probably healthy debates. I mean, I think there's also at times like, how much do you talk about the US versus Canada, and like, how do you kind of blend? You know, I think that the bigger challenge for us was probably like, how do you take two different voices who have like kind of different lenses that you're looking and try to blend it in a way that still feels authentic to each of us. But from a topic perspective, you know,
I can't think of any one thing that we disagreed on in terms of actual content.
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah.
I was like thinking back.
There's probably more that like just had to get left on the cutting room floor because we're like, okay, there's too much here, like too deep into one area, and like, you know, Akwasi knows a lot more about the history of regulations and things, and I know a lot more about like the development of businesses, and so it's like, how do you kind of create that balance too? And what neither of us know very well is the science, and so we're like, okay, we can cut that out, right? And so
different book. I think that's probably why we didn't have. There was very little tension because, and this was, you know, again, part of why it seemed like such a good collaboration is we were coming from these kind of different professional vantage points, right? I think the one piece of overlap is kind of the advocacy work, but again, there are different jurisdictions, and so yeah, there was very little tension.
Yeah, and I think that for some of it, the solutions aren't necessarily there yet, right? So our biggest point was like, we know what the end goal we'd like, and we could probably still debate this on like, on the social equity side, what is the right model? We don't know yet, and this is probably like part of the V2 that we'll eventually go into. And that's where things might differ and like what takes more priority. But this was really for us a way to gather all the information and try to digest it, to give it out. And then I feel like there could be more debate to come down the path on like, you know, where do things sit in a priority perspective? But right now we're like, everything is a priority. To answer your second question about the conflict, it was interesting for me, just from having that, you know, pretty traditional family, you know, nobody touches alcohol, nobody is like, it's a very by the book family, but at the same time, there's a strong appreciation for plant medicine. Like my family has always been strong advocates of homeopathic medicine. My father is a Western physician, but would always try to give his patients homeopathic medicine before he had to give them a prescription pain medication. So that was how our home operated too. It's like we very rarely took medications over homeopathic medicine. And so not that cannabis was something like, oh, of course. I mean, my parents very much, they had their own stigma towards it, but the understanding, interestingly enough, was there on like, okay, this could be, this could make sense, particularly on the medical side. They're not strong advocates on using it recreationally. And that's fine, right? But it's interesting. It's not something we actually, you know, we joke about it, but it's not like a point of tension. And surprisingly, in my broader family, it has like, they're more entertained by it than anything. They're like, of course, you're the one who's working in this space. And I'm like, yes, you're welcome. But I think that there is just a trend, not just in my family, but in broader communities, moving away from prescription medications and trying to find more natural. And this is kind of like the right time to be having that conversation about cannabis and I think the other psychedelics and things that we've been talking about, which in a lot of South Asia, East Asia, they've been part of the culture for a really long time, religion or not, you know, and so I think that is an element that people need to remember as well.
Thank you so much. I'm Catherine Janito with the MIT Press, and I just joined this last year, and it's been so fascinating for me to come to sessions like this and hear from the authors. You both are such incredible storytellers, and I can't wait to read the book. I should have read it before this, but my question is, and I know you've answered this in different ways, but when you came together and wrote the book, what is your biggest hope for this as it's out in the world?
I would say number one, that it seriously informs kind of federal regulation, right? And again, I think we need to acknowledge that there's been a lot of work done by others on this. Like we're really, you know, in many ways crowdsourcing. And so, you know, you can look at various iterations of legislation that have come forth federally that include many of the provisions that we're arguing for, and that it has international reach as well. You know, one of the things I find most interesting are other jurisdictions that are looking to legalize. I've got an unanswered email from a couple of weeks ago from someone in the German government, you know, wanting to have German officials, and I've spoken to numerous, talk about these very issues. I'm from the UK originally, and, you know, we've got a very similar history with respect to enforcement in the United Kingdom. So not only that it informs how things progress, you know, in North America, but in other parts of the world too. You know, one of the parts that we didn't really touch upon in the book, and this could perhaps be for V3, is so a couple things. One of the things I want to say is we need to recognize that for most of human history, drugs have not been illegal, right? So prohibition is really a historical aberration, and one that is very recent. But also when we think about the impacts of the war on drugs, and we talk about the statistics of the people who've been incarcerated in this country and the others covered in the book, we're doing nothing to talk about the devastation that drug prohibition in the United States and Canada and the United Kingdom, other parts of Europe, has caused to, countries in the global South. Think about, you know, what's happening in Mexico. And so as well, when we talk about kind of reparative aspects, we need to think beyond our own borders to the other jurisdictions that have also been harmed by drug prohibition, and how efforts can be made again as we legalize to repair those harms too.
I say this part jokingly, but very seriously, like I really wanted people to be outraged after reading this, because there's so many people who I think don't have even the level of insight, or even at a high level. And we both felt like this was so important for people to understand. And this isn't just about cannabis. This is broader about race relations, criminalization, what has continued to happen for decades and really has impacted the world because the US in particular just dictates so much of that. And we want more people to know about it, to use that as a place of advocacy and to use storytelling as a way to approach social justice. Because again, like as we talk about the humanization side of it is so important. And so for me, it was a big part is just like creating awareness and then being able to create a platform to tell the stories and then pass the mic to the people who can keep telling the stories, because there's so many people who, these people aren't stats. They are real people. There are tens of thousands of them, and then their families beyond that. And we have a lot of work to do. And this is a small step, I think, in a way to just start working in that direction. So that was my hope. And then, I jokingly, I do say outrage, but I want people to be fired up when they read that, I want people to know, and we get fired up about it. And I think that's why we were always so entertained, because we'd be like reading new facts or we'd have interviews with people and we would just be like, we can't wait to tell people about this, because we want that feeling to that's what moves communities and populations. That's what it takes. And it takes more people. And, there's so many other topics like abortion and gun rights and all that stuff I could go into, but like, this is one big topic in itself. And there's so many different layers and we want change. And so this is one way to, it's our hope to start making it by writing this book.
We have a question online and it goes, as more and more states and countries legalize marijuana, what initiatives are available for people who have been wrongfully incarcerated?
Wrongfully, well, so as a criminologist, I think wrongfully incarcerated being individuals who were put behind bars when they hadn't actually committed the offense for which they were criminalized. But I would argue that many people, if not all of them, who've been criminalized for cannabis-related offenses are wrongfully convicted. That is a big question, absolutely. So, for the incarcerated, I think one of the most important things is assistance with reintegration, right? One of the biggest challenges that people who've been incarcerated face is simply how to operate and navigate in society once they are released back into the community. And so, of course, that starts with stable housing. That starts with assistance with things like employment, and it starts with addressing any kind of health and mental health issues that those people might be facing. And so, again, this is the very type of initiative or the focus that funds that are generated from legal sales could then go to support. There are a multitude of agencies across this country and others that help people reintegrate back into society, but there are huge gaps that need to be filled. Reintegration is abysmal in so many places. And so, for the formerly incarcerated, simple assistance with reintegration is key. And then again, legal cannabis opens up avenues and opportunities for people who want to operate in legal cannabis spaces. And for those who have been formerly incarcerated for cannabis-related offenses, if they want to get into legal markets, that again is something we believe they should have priority access to.
We have another online question.
You can never know how your questions land with people who are online. They might be, throwing their food at a computer screen.
This is a long one. It says, hello, thank you for this great discussion. I'm a researcher at MIT studying the cannabis industry. How would you respond to critiques of equity, and they put it in quotation marks, discourse that claim it is ultimately about promoting Black capitalism? You're advocating for broad reparations through market participation. Is this truly giving justice, or is it reinforcing the economic status quo? Is it possible to make reparations that isn't about marketing and commodifying the substance? And I can repeat any part of that.
Yeah, I think so. It's a really interesting question. And the discussion that we've had in the past and other conversation is like, who is responsible for reparations? What one body? And the truth is there isn't one body, right? It needs to come in many shapes and many forms. And yes, the people today, we haven't made the decisions that have impacted the past, but we are part of the solution of the future. And one element when thinking about cannabis, we've talked a lot about, okay, taking tax revenue, which comes from the consumption and the purchase of cannabis to contribute back to these populations. But it's not necessarily that we're thinking like, okay, the consumption of it is the growing consumption is what's actually going to provide those reparations. That shouldn't be the case. It should be disconnected. So there's an element of like, if you move away from the over policing, the over incarceration, like all the resources that go there, and you think about it in the context of saving, if you take savings across the boards and this isn't just about cannabis, this is like broad criminalization and where all those resources are going, those savings enough should be like, that should be an element of like the reparations, the contributions back into the elements, because it's not just about cannabis. This is like proliferated a lot of different areas. And one comment that's also come up, it's like, well, what if this happened when we were in Toronto, that what about like police? Like they won't have as much, they'll lose work. I'm like, there is so much other stuff that they could be doing right now than going after people smoking or possessing cannabis, right? Then because police are all overworked. They're limited on resources. That is the complaint that we hear. And they're too stretched. So like give them bandwidth back by having not focused on these areas and like go after the murderers and the terrorists and like do more there. And so I'm like, police are not going to have a problem when it comes to jobs. Like people are not going to lose jobs. This is actually going to create a more, I think, beneficial community, and people are actually going to be able to focus on the areas that are needed more. And then in that, I think there'll be more ways that you can find that savings from like the reduction is actually can be contributed more broadly, not necessarily related to cannabis, but just related to the communities that have been really harmed. And if you stop focusing on them and creating them as targets, how do you what Akwasi talked about, like take it from one area and put it to where it really is needed. So that's kind of a broad, vague answer, but it's not just about the cannabis industry and the taxing. It's about all of the things that you are kind of saving and you can redistribute.
And key as well is just recognition of harm, right? Like these proposals are in part a simple recognition of harm. And again, this is part of a much broader history and much broader structural problems. But like I can't conscionably envision any model of cannabis legalization that doesn't recognize those harms and make efforts to repair them as it's rolled out.
Yeah, I appreciate you walking through that. Obviously, the part of the restorative justice part of me, it's speaking to, but I think even more importantly, the transformative part, which I think you're getting into, not just the kind of myopic, we criminalize people, we're going to decriminalize them,
Yeah.
but that there's a whole system that's built around this that also needs to be transformed as well. And when we take the lens of harm and addressing how this is harmed, it gives us more opportunity and more possibility to transform
To
them.
that point, like I think we need to recognize just how much drugs and drug law enforcement has led to the proliferation of the criminal justice system and the prison industrial complex, right? Like when you declare a war, you need troops to fight that war, you need supplies, right? And this is, when we talk about the militarization of policing, some came because of surplus military weapons, but some came because, of course, this war was being waged. And again, this is in part a recognition of that and an effort to address.
I want to thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, for your time here tonight. This was wonderful, and thank you all for attending.
Say another thank you for everyone for coming and for the questions from online. They're always wonderful. Thank you, Nina, as well.
Thank you both for your work. Yeah.
I just wanted to say quickly that we hope you'll attend some future MIT libraries and MIT Press programming. You can find more about MIT libraries programming by visiting libraries.mit.edu/news, and about MIT Press and MIT Press bookstore events at mitpress.mit.edu/events. MIT Press Bookstore will be at Microsoft Nerd next week on May 8th with Harmeet Sawhney, co-author of the recent MIT Press publication, Universal Access and its Asymmetries. So very much looking forward to that. I'm sorry, I said May 8th, it's May 11th. So for the next 15 minutes or so, the authors will be available for a book signing. We appreciate your attendance. The webinar portion will now conclude. We thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone.